Hey guys, Mortorgus here. So in this video I want to give you my impressions on Nocturne and the other Shadow Walls cards that were revealed with him. Basically most of them surrounding the concept of Nightfall and that such thing. I know I'm a little bit behind on my impressions, but I'm going to try and get this one out as well as the Leona and the Diana stuff. And I do have a little bit more perspective because I have seen those already. So we'll be able to kind of give more context to this a little more than if I had done it exactly when it had been revealed. But nonetheless, let's get into it and check it out. And like I said, there are going to be a lot of Nightfall cards in here, and in case you're unaware, Nightfall is the effect that you trigger it if it's not the first card you played this turn. So you have to play something else first. It's kind of like combo in Hearthstone if you're familiar with that. You just have to make sure that something else was played beforehand. And some of these cards you're going to see, it's going to be a little more difficult to make that work. But let's just hop into it. Alright, so first off we'll check out Nocturne himself. He is a 4-mana 5/3 with Fearsome, and Nightfall grant an enemy vulnerable and give enemies -1/-0 this round. Then his level up condition is once you've attacked with 5+ Nightfall allies, he will gain the effect that all of your other allies have Fearsome, and when you play a unit, give enemies -1/-0 this round. So obviously looking at Nocturne, we see that he's a 4-mana 5/3 with Fearsome. That's a pretty good stat line for that effect, because it is you do want to be offensively statted when you have Fearsome. You want to try and get that damage across. He does come off as somewhat of an aggressive minion, and his Nightfall effect is really good in the way that you can give an enemy vulnerable, and then all the other enemies that you have there are potentially not going to be able to block you with your Fearsome, because 3 health or 3 attack is a pretty common breakpoint for you to be worrying about. A lot of the times you'll have smaller stuff, and then like they have a few 3 attack guys that are going to be there to block the Fearsomes. But if you do manage to knock down their attack by 1, that's a lot of the time going to be enough. And then giving vulnerable to the one thing that's still able to block lets you pull it with something other than Nocturne, so you can get that 5 damage, and maybe you pull it with something like a Spider that's only a 1/1 or something, and is not going to be getting enough damage onto their face anyways, and probably doesn't have Fearsome. So I do think that's pretty cool. And I do think you could combine him with some other Fearsome guys so that that really goes off pretty well. But then you have his level up condition, which is you have to attack with 5+ Nightfall allies. That feels like something that's going to take a while to get done. And these Nightfall allies are often looking very underwhelming, especially the Shadow Isle ones. The Targon ones aren't actually too bad, I suppose. Especially Diana. Like, having Diana in there is probably what you're really going to need in order to make sure that this does happen. And I'm going to find it hard for you to combine this with other regions and such because of that. But I also don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with this Nightfall archetype having to be a Targon Shadow Isles region combo, and that you have to combine those 2 champions. There are a few different champion combos like that in the game right now where you really can't do it any other way. You have to pair it with something that exact way. Like Quinn is always with Misfortune right now. It's just how she's got to be. So I don't think there's necessarily a problem there. It's just a little bit inflexible, unfortunately, in that way. And then when you do level him up, this whole when you play a unit, give enemies -1 attack for this round. Again, it comes off as a very aggressive type of thing to do, you want to be playing like a lot of one drops, I guess, if you want to be dropping their attack a bunch. You're probably just gonna have to normally just play like one unit and hope that that's enough. And I mean, if it was enough on the Nightfall effect, it'll be enough on this too. But if you really are trying to like spam out a board and have them all have fearsome and there be nothing blocking and all that kind of a thing, it's hard for me to imagine a state where you have that many cards to play by the time he's finally leveled up in an aggressive deck, and also you haven't won by now. So Nocturne's initial body really gives you this aggressive impression, but his leveled up version is much more of a slow game plan than you'd expect from it, from what I can tell. So it's kind of this like weird dichotomy of like balancing that. It kind of makes him lean more mid-range in that case, but I also wouldn't feel entirely bad about just running him without having to worry about him ever leveling up, and that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. You just run a few Nightfall allies here and there, and then you have the potential, at least, to be able to level him up, even if it's not important to your game plan. So, yeah, just looking at him, I think, compared to all the other champions, I think he's the least exciting for me. I think he's the most awkward looking, especially just these Nightfall cards that we're going to be looking at are pretty awkward looking. It might be that I just need to do some theory crafting and kind of see the deck and what it's going to look like and how it's going to mesh, and maybe even going to have to try it out for myself to actually see how he plays and if it's really worth having him in there. And I mean, I think that every champion kind of finds a place somewhere from what we've seen, even if it's not the most competitive thing in the world. But yeah, I think compared to the other champions we've seen, I think this one's definitely the least exciting. But I'll definitely try it out and try to make it work. And I think at the very least, you're probably going to want to run him with Diana just because of that Nightfall synergy and building that whole Nightfall deck. Alright, so the next card we have is Unspeakable Horror, which is also Nocturne's champion spell. It's a 2-mana fast spell. Drain 1 from anything and create a random Nightfall card in your hand if you trigger the Nightfall. So it's very comparable to Vile Feast because it is a 2-mana fast speed spell that drains 1, though this one can target face, which is sometimes relevant. Sometimes you do need that reach of just 1, and that's enough to get you there. Or maybe even if your opponent's trying to cast some damage spells on you, you can heal for that 1 without having to expect any minions to be there for you to target with it or anything like that. So we obviously know that Vile Feast is a very competitive card, and that part of it's definitely going to be good. In terms of the Nightfall effect, I'd say that creating a Nightfall card in hand is certainly not a bad thing to have at all. It's going to be a lot better in that Diana Nocturne deck instead of if you ever do pair this with anything else. I mean, if you wanted to run this in a non-Nightfall deck and just have this extra value possibility, you are going to be stuck with just the Shadow Isles Nightfall cards, which are much, much less exciting than the Targon ones from what I can tell. But at least in that deck, it'll be pretty interesting. You'll definitely have to keep that in mind, because if you hit some really useless Nightfall cards, the value of the creating a random Nightfall card in your hand is certainly not going to be that great. But this is kind of like a alternative in some ways to Vile Feast. Is like a tempo defensive kind of drain 1 effect, and then this one's like your value one. So this one's better in slower matchups, and Vile Feast is better in faster matchups. So it might be possible that you run like some equation of like how much Vile Feast versus how much Unspeakable Horror, depending on the meta. You might want some Unspeakable Horrors to deal with some slower matchups. But I'm not quite so certain about that. I think Vile Feast is still a lot better. I might want this in a Nightfall deck just so you just keep getting more Nightfall cards, and it certainly helps you level up Diana while you're at it, and it will give you more things to play while also keeping you in the game by removing that stuff while you're at it. So it certainly doesn't look bad. It's not incredibly impactful, I think, but you'll definitely see it around. Whether it makes it out of Nightfall decks or not is another story, but I don't think that's going to be super important anyways. But definitely any 2-mana drain one is going to be at least decently solid. Then we have Shroud of Darkness, 1-mana burst spell. At the next time you summon an ally this round, give it +1/+0 and spell shield this round. So this is clearly a Nightfall activator card, because you play it first, then you play a minion, you trigger its Nightfall effect, and you get this nice upside of having extra attack and spell shield. I think this definitely fits the aggressive game plan very nicely of getting something down. It's protected from being able to be removed by anything, so it's going to have to be dealt with in combat. And especially with a few of these like fearsome units, sometimes they won't be able to deal with it in combat because they won't have anything to block it with. So that certainly seems quite nice. I don't know if the spell shield's always going to be relevant, and you might just need to play this out anyways, which is going to feel a little bad, but at least you are getting that extra 1 attack. You are having to commit the spell shield before you know that there's any spells coming, so like this versus Bastion, obviously Bastion's a lot better, but Bastion costs 2 more mana, so of course this should be worse than that. So I think this will be quite a good Nightfall activator in Nightfall decks when you are, of course, running the Nightfall cards with Shadow Isles and stuff like that. It'll probably fit into other aggressive Shadow Isles decks as well. Like maybe if we do end up with elusives in Shadow Isles and stuff like that, you might feel inclined towards playing this and that to protect your Green Glade duos and things like that. So that definitely seems really good. So I think this one's going to be quite an impactful card. Then we have Risen Mists, 4-mana burst spell, summon a Mistwraith. So 4 mana for a Mistwraith is quite a lot. Mistwraiths do cost 2 mana, and you also get them off the Allegiance on Wraithcaller. So those are the 2 ways we get them right now. This is an additional way to get them. So despite the fact that it is quite a bit of mana, you are summoning a Mistwraith. In a Mistwraith deck, that could be very good, and I've seen Mistwraith decks be quite powerful when I've tried them out, so that's definitely not a bad thing at all. But even more importantly, it's a burst spell. So you're burst summoning. There are not a lot of burst summoning effects right now. They're basically all in Piltover, and they're all based around discard, and they're definitely not very large at that. Whereas this could be a situation where in a Mistwraith deck, if you had buffed them up a decent amount, you could have it so that your opponent attacks, then you play this, and suddenly you have a blocker that can remove a large minion when a second ago you did not. And also, at the same time, it means that when you're on open attack, you can summon a Mistwraith and attack at the same time, getting an extra unit to attack with without having to pass priority over to your opponent. Both of those situations are very strong, and the fact that this is much larger than the Scrap Scuttlers and stuff, things like that we've seen in burst summoning effects before that really haven't been that impactful, I think this one's going to be a lot better. Now, obviously, outside of Mistwraith decks, I don't really think this will make any sense. Summoning a 4-mana 2/2 Fearsome. I mean, maybe that's not the worst thing ever at burst speed, but you're still probably only really going to want this in a Mistwraith deck. But I do think it's very possible that we could have a competitive Mistwraith deck and this fit in there. Without a doubt. It may end up being too expensive, who knows, we'll see. But I think that it will probably end up being quite good and actually fit into that deck, and I think that deck will be pretty decent. Then we have Stalking Shadows. 2-mana burst spell. Pick a follower from the top 4 cards in your deck, draw it, and shuffle the rest into your deck, then create an ephemeral copy in hand. So, obviously the extra copy being ephemeral is sometimes going to be a lot worse. Generally going to be a lot worse. But you're only paying 2 mana, and 2 mana to tutor something off the top 4 cards is often going to be good enough. The ephemeral copy upside is really awesome. Granted, the top 4 cards could be anything. It's not necessarily going to be the best follower that you can get. Sometimes you might only have 1 follower there and that's all you can grab. Sometimes you'll have no followers and you get nothing, which is almost never going to happen unless you have a very spell-heavy deck. And obviously you wouldn't put this in a super spell-heavy deck if you didn't expect it to work for you. But in normal cases, I think a lot of the time you're just going to get to draw a unit and be able to play it immediately, have this extra ephemeral copy. I think this will fit into a lot of decks. It's very cheap card draw. It gets you something specific that you got to pick from, at least a small sample of cards that you want to look at. So I definitely find it hard to believe that you wouldn't want to put this in a deck somewhere. What kind of deck this fits in is not entirely certain. I think normally it's going to go in faster decks where you do want to grab your more important followers and then get that extra copy of it when you need it to try and end out the games before you have to wait to draw into them. Though it can probably fit into other decks too, like in a slower deck, getting an extra ephemeral copy of some of these big impactful cards could be a big deal. So I think it's going to be really good. I think this one looks very exciting. Then we have a lot of these Nightfall cards that were revealed before that. So we have Stygian Onlooker, 1 mana, 2/1, Nightfall, give me +2 attack and fearsome this round. So it's uncertain whether the Nightfall has to be triggered for Nocturne to actually level up off of these things. Assuming that it doesn't have to be, which makes more sense to me at least. You could still play this on turn 1 and attack with it when you have your opponent's Nexus open and don't expect any blockers, or maybe even if you do expect a blocker, you could make a trade, whatever. But in that case, at least you're getting some attacks across and maybe leveling up Nocturne faster. But the thing is about these Nightfalls is you're going to have to generally have spell mana probably, because you're going to want to use a spell to trigger them, potentially, or other 1-drops, stuff like that. So a lot of the time, you're probably going to want to trigger the Nightfall for this. That means you're playing it later on, turn 2 at the earliest, right? Maybe you do like a double 1-drop on turn 2. And you get this down there. It's certainly quite a lot of damage. If you do get it on turn 2, it probably will get to go face, as long as it doesn't get removed by a spell like Vile Feast instead of actually being able to attack. But having a blocker that can block Fearsome on turn 2 is very unlikely. So it looks like a pretty good aggro card in that way. Having a few 1-drops and doing the double 1-drop turn is certainly something we've seen from more aggressive decks before, so it shouldn't be that unexpected to be able to make that happen. So he does look quite good as a aggressive Nightfall card. My only concern with that is the other Nightfall cards don't necessarily look like they might be able to sustain that kind of a deck, and that they might be a little bit too slow or too awkward, and the fact that you do have to trigger Nightfall on them slows them down even further. So despite the fact that I do like this as an aggro Nightfall card, we'll see if a deck for it really ends up making sense. He may fit into other aggressive decks that aren't all about Nightfall, just because it is quite a decent damage output that you can expect from it. So we could see that happen too. But definitely iffy on the whole Nightfall idea that really leans in on this guy. Alright, so the next one is Doombeast, 3 mana, 3/2 with Nightfall, drain 2 from the enemy Nexus. So obviously a 3 mana, 3/2, quite understated for its mana cost. The fact that you do have to trigger the Nightfall adds more awkwardness to the situation, and I'm really not sure if the drain 2 is really worth it, even when you do get it off. Obviously, you're never going to play this without the Nightfall because it's going to be really bad. But I suppose if you do manage to trigger it, it's a little bit of burn. It might be some reach for you to be able to end out a game once you're kind of reaching that point where you need to get that little bit of extra damage, and you're kind of losing the board at that point potentially. And it's also a little bit of healing, at least, to keep you in the game. But overall, I'm really feeling down on this card. It looks very underwhelming, and it's one of the cards that make me feel pretty iffy about the whole idea of having Nightfall in Shadow Isles and such. And these kinds of minions are the reasons why I'm not super into Nocturne in general. Then we have a Duskrider, 5 mana, 2/5, fearsome, and Nightfall grant me +1/+0 for each time you've activated Nightfall this game. So this one is a big like Nightfall payoff card. You do have to trigger the Nightfall on it as well as all the other Nightfalls beforehand. So if you hit like 5/5 fearsome, you're like, I guess. I mean, is it really worth it to have to still trigger another Nightfall to make that go off? So you're probably going to want more than that, like a lot of stats on this guy. So it's going to take a while to get there, and it's probably not coming out on turn 5, maybe turn 6 or whatever. Like, if you do get it off on turn 5, you're definitely gonna have to stick with like a 5/5 at best. And I mean, that might be fine, but your opponent's probably still gonna be able to block it. The fearsome's probably not gonna matter that much, and it'll basically just be a 5/5. So why are you wasting your time triggering a Nightfall to get a 5/5 when its keyword is probably not gonna matter? I mean, it might be really impactful and might win you some games, but generally speaking, I think it's going to be very underwhelming. It's a slow Nightfall card, and we're really seeing that you want them to be faster. You want these cards to be able to get your Nocturne leveled up a lot earlier and things like that. If you do level up your Nocturne, then potentially combining these two together at the same time is going to be very good, because you make it so that they can't block your Duskrider anymore with the reducing their attack effect. But then you're going to have to somehow keep both of these alive on board at the same time, and your opponent's not just sitting there and letting all this happen. So again, this one's looking quite uninspired to me. I'm not super interested in this one. I'm thinking maybe we're not even running a lot of this. I don't even know. when you're making these Nightfall decks. I think we're going to lean a lot more on the Targon side, and this one might not even make it into Nightfall decks outside of sometimes being generated by the Unspeakable Horror. Then we have Encroaching Shadow, 4 mana, burst spell, grant all allies in deck and hand +2/+2 and ephemeral. So every single ally is now ephemeral, but its buff is crap, and you can stack these. So if you did manage to play a few of these, the ephemeral kind of drawback of the whole situation no longer relevant because you've already paid that kind of cost to it. The only cost would be the 4 mana, which is not irrelevant, but it's certainly worth it over time once you've played a ton of things. So obviously this is going to have to go in an aggressive deck. It could work in 2 different ways. I'd say is either A, it's going in a deck that's already running ephemerals, so you're not really losing out on anything, you're just making them bigger. But we already see that ephemerals haven't been that great, and a lot of them are summoned through effects and therefore wouldn't be buffed by this. A lot of the ephemeral minions that you get aren't actually minions that you play. They're like the Hecarim riders, or the spell itself that summons Hecarim riders. There's like Chariot, there's Zed Shadows, there's all these ephemeral units in these ephemeral decks that don't actually start in your deck. So that doesn't super make as much sense, but where I do think it makes a lot of sense is in elusives, where you just get tons of damage across because they're all going under your opponent's minions because they're elusive. Sometimes you want to have them there and attack a few times with them, but a lot of the time hitting once is really enough, and you just play another one and hit them with that one, and you play another one, hit them with that one, and that's how you end up winning the game. So I think this will definitely make elusives and Shadow Isles be something to definitely consider, and I think it will probably be very strong. And the last card we're looking at today is Passage Unearned. 3 mana, fast spell, obliterate all units that were summoned but not played this round. So this is a really interesting one because there are definitely matchups where this would do nothing, or at least it would do not enough that you could really justify even having it in your deck. And that's really crazy, because in other matchups, it could be so impactful that it could win you the game on the spot. And that is so polarizing. It's like if they play Harrowing, you play this, you're probably winning that game. You spent 3 mana to counter their entire Harrowing. I mean, sometimes people play the box to counter Harrowing, but you're not necessarily removing everything with just the box. But this, like, if you use this against like a Nivea's or something like that, in that kind of a deck, that's really cool. Like, it's often, I'm thinking probably a Shadow Isles counter. In terms of other decks that really summon a lot and don't play things, and they all do it at the same turn, it's really hard to say. I mean, you don't have to remove a lot with this. 1 or 2 kind of decently sized things are fine. Like, even if you were to obliterate a 3/4 off of the scout unit in Demacia, I can't even remember what it's called, Grizzled Ranger, I think, is that what it is? If you were to remove that with this, it wouldn't be terrible. It would basically just be like 3 mana deal 4, and that's pretty premium, right? So I think you'd probably be able to fit one of these into a Shadow Isles control deck. as long as you expect at least some summon things in most meta decks. And especially if you're countering some really big like harrowing decks and stuff like that, I think it would actually be worth running. Even if in some matchups it just feels like a dead card. So while it's definitely going to feel bad to have it sometimes, I think it's going to feel so good to have it in other times. It's going to find some ways into some decks as long as the meta permits. It's definitely not going into any non-control decks, but definitely in a control deck in Shadow Isles, and we know that Shadow Isles is normally the best control region after all. I think this will find a way to make it in there and sometimes make some huge plays. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it so much. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it. Comment down below what you think of Nocturne and the Shadow Isles Nightfall package if you are planning on trying it out on day one. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content in the future. And again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it so much. And I'll see you guys in the next one.